Cassie Everett's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages of her notes, her eyes skimming the well-worn bullet points that had become almost invisible from the hours she had spent memorizing them. The stress of the past week had been suffocating. Tonight's presentation on temporal mechanics, the culmination of months of research, was only hours away, but her confidence was crumbling. No matter how many times she rehearsed, she knew she'd stumble. Cassie's phone buzzed, interrupting her train of thought. Mark. His text was a reminder that they still hadn't resolved last night's argument. She stared at the screen for a moment before tossing the phone onto the couch. There wasn't time for that now. As she opened the door to leave for campus, she noticed a small brown package sitting on the front step. There was no address, no return label. Her name was written neatly across the top in black ink, just her first name. It wasn't something she'd ordered, and no one had mentioned sending her anything. Curiosity piqued, Cassie picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It was light, almost weightless. She debated leaving it, but her nerves got the better of her. She slid her finger under the edge of the tape, tearing it open. Inside, nestled in plain tissue paper, was a small, sleek device. It was silver, about the size of a deck of cards, with a smooth digital interface on one side. Cassie frowned, not sure what to make of it. There was no note, no instructions. She tucked it into her bag and left, figuring she'd deal with it later. As she walked to campus, her mind shifted back to the presentation. There was too much at stake to worry about some strange gadget, but the device weighed on her mind. The way it fit so perfectly in her hand, it felt almost familiar, like something she had seen before. Cassie walked into the lecture hall, heart pounding. The room was already filling with faculty members, including her mentor, Dr. Samuel Weiss, a man known for his keen eye and unforgiving critique. His presence alone heightened her anxiety. She could feel the pressure of his expectations settling over her. The minutes leading up to her presentation crawled by in a haze of nerves and dread. When her name was called, Cassie's mind blanked. She walked to the front of the room, her hands shaking as she gripped her notes. The first few words came out jumbled. She tried to recover, but it felt like the harder she tried, the more tangled her thoughts became. Her slides flickered behind her, but the words on the screen blurred. As she reached for the next point, she could see Dr. Weiss frowning, his sharp eyes catching every misstep. When she finally finished, a thick silence settled in the room. Cassie stood there, sweat beading at her brow, fighting the urge to run. Dr. Weiss cleared his throat, gave her a curt nod, and the faculty began to gather their notes. The polite clapping that followed only deepened her humiliation. She fled the lecture hall, feeling utterly defeated. All that work, all those sleepless nights, wasted in 10 agonizing minutes. By the time she reached her apartment, the weight of failure was crushing her. Cassie dumped her bag on the couch, her hands still shaking. Out of frustration, she reached inside and pulled out the strange device from earlier. She turned it over in her hands, unsure of what it was or why it had been sent to her. It seemed too advanced to be a simple gadget. Her thumb brushed across the smooth surface and the screen flickered to life. A single word blinked on the screen: rewind. Without thinking, she pressed it. The world around her rippled like the surface of disturbed water. Cassie felt a strange tug in her chest as her vision blurred for a second, then snapped back into focus. Suddenly, she wasn't sitting on her couch anymore. She was back in the lecture hall, standing in front of the faculty members, just as she had been before her presentation. Panic surged through her, but then something impossible dawned on her. She was here again. It wasn't a memory. She could feel the lectern under her fingers, hear the faint buzzing of the projector. This wasn't déjà vu. This was real. She looked down at her notes. Her heart skipped a beat. She could do it again. Her mind raced. If this was real, she had a chance to fix everything. This time, Cassie breathed deeply, steadying herself before she began to speak. The words came out clearly, confidently. She guided her audience through the intricacies of her research with practiced ease. The slides transitioned smoothly, and her points landed exactly as she had rehearsed them. The sense of triumph building in her chest was undeniable. As she finished, the room responded with approving nods. Dr. Weiss even offered a rare smile of approval. Cassie felt a thrill of satisfaction she hadn't felt in weeks. When she left the lecture hall this time, it was with her head held high. The nagging voice of self-doubt had vanished. She'd fixed her mistake. She'd rewound time. The strange device had given her a second chance, and it had worked. Back at her apartment, Cassie examined the device again, her curiosity flaring. Was it really that simple? Could she use it for other moments, other failures? The device's screen had gone dark, but she could feel its power in her hand. Just as she was about to place it back in her bag, a strange symbol flickered on the screen for a split second before disappearing. Cassie stared at the blank screen, her mind buzzing with possibilities. It worked. The device could actually rewind time. She replayed the events of the day in her head, disbelief and excitement mixing into an intoxicating rush. She could fix things. She could have control. Later that evening, her phone buzzed again. It was Leah, her best friend, asking if they were still on for drinks. Cassie frowned, momentarily confused. She didn't remember making plans, but maybe it had slipped her mind in the chaos of the day. She brushed off the unease and agreed to meet. At the bar, Leah was her usual lively self, but something felt off. Cassie couldn't place it, but small things began to nag at her. Leah mentioned an argument Cassie had with Mark the night before, an argument Cassie couldn't recall. When Leah pressed, Cassie's mind went blank. She hadn't argued with Mark, had she? Cassie shrugged it off as stress. After a short evening, she excused herself and headed home, the unease still clinging to her. Alone in her apartment, she pulled out the device again, turning it over in her hands. What if she rewound a smaller event, something insignificant, just to see if it worked as seamlessly? She pressed the button and rewound to that morning's conversation with Mark, one that had been mundane at best. This time, when the conversation replayed, something felt different. Mark's responses were clipped, his tone distant. He seemed colder than before. Was it her imagination? Her mind buzzed with doubt. Had she changed something? Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't quite right. Every interaction, every glance from Mark now seemed off. His responses were short, his expressions colder than she remembered. Even Leah had noticed a shift in her mood, although Cassie couldn't pinpoint why. She sat in her apartment that night, staring at the device in her hands. Maybe the rewinds were more powerful than she realized. What if they didn't just fix one mistake, but altered everything around her? The idea sent a chill through her. Was this too much control? Deciding to test it again, she rewound a brief moment earlier in the evening, just to replay her exit from the bar, thinking she might pick up on a detail she had missed. This time, as the rewind finished, she looked around expecting the same world. But there was a subtle shift. A photograph on her wall, one she swore had been of her and Leah, now showed Cassie with two people she didn't recognize. Her heart raced as she reached out to touch it. What was happening? Was the device changing more than just her actions? Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. She jumped, her pulse quickening. When she opened it, there was no one there, just a small envelope resting on the mat. Her name was written across it in handwriting that looked eerily familiar. With shaking hands, Cassie opened it. Inside was a single note, scrawled in black ink, "Stop rewinding." Cassie dropped the letter as if it had burned her fingers. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She glanced around her apartment, her mind racing. Who had sent the note? How did they know what she had been doing? And more importantly, what did they know about the device? She paced the room, her thoughts spiraling. It couldn't be possible. No one knew about the rewinds. The device was hers, a strange anomaly, but still hers. She thought about Dr. Weiss's cryptic remarks earlier about time's invisible threads. Could he have known? Her eyes darted back to the device, sitting innocently on the table. The urge to rewind and erase this moment, this creeping sense of dread, overwhelmed her. She grabbed it, her hands trembling, and pressed the button once more. This time the device flickered, its screen flashing erratically. Cassie's stomach dropped as she felt the familiar tug of the rewind, but something was wrong. It wasn't smooth like before. The world around her shuddered violently, colors blurring, shapes warping. When the rewind finished, she wasn't in her apartment anymore. She was standing outside, in front of a house she didn't recognize, watching a version of herself she didn't remember. Cassie's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of it. Her reflection in the window was different. Her clothes, her hair, even her posture. The other version of herself was talking to someone, a man she didn't recognize. Panic gripped her. Before she could react, the world snapped back, and she found herself sitting on her couch once more. Everything was back to normal. Or was it? Her eyes flickered to the photo on the wall. It was different again. The people in it weren't strangers anymore. They were people she knew. People from this new, altered timeline. The door opened. Mark walked in, but when he saw her, confusion washed over his face. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and uncertain.
This is the end of the episode. Thank you for listening. If you like the story, please subscribe to our channel and check out our other stories. You can find the link to the next episode in the description below. What do you think about this episode? Let us know in the comment section below.